This night go shining bright, colors dance in the night. You don't owe them a thing, it's not up for debate.
Is that right?
Hey everybody. Let me just make sure I'm live. Okay, look, it worked. So I had some time to think about what the deal could be with the motions for independent testing. Is that what it was? Oh, yes, independent analysis of evidence, as well as the order staying order. Yeah. So I know that this case has revolved around this DNA. I've often thought about what is the original domino that Jay Loxton was talking about in, it was the objection to the protective order of the IGG. Now, what if the original domino is whatever they collected from the sheath is a partial mixture? Because all likelihood, it should be a partial mixture. That's typically what trace transfer DNA is. And I know that we're all taught that the state is supposed to be honest and they're supposed to do things in a straightforward way. So, I guess from a public view, we would think, okay, they really do have a DNA match. And so that they're going to go to trial with that. However, it's my understanding that the DNA doesn't have to match the defendant for the DNA that they want to use to be admissible. All they have to say is, it could be. And here is some scientific evidence or methodologies that say it could be Brian's DNA. But from the first few times that I read that PCA, it didn't say in there that it was his DNA. It gave a statistic for the 99.98 for a paternity test. And then it also said they did a comparison of the DNA on the sheath and the defendant's DNA. Doing a comparison is an action. That is not a result. And that type of language, Kibo, Daniel, welcome guys, good to see you. So, and I've noticed that the state does use this slippery language where they will just state they did an analysis. Or also in the PCA, they will say, we did an STR test. And this is typically what happens when you do an STR test. We look at so many regions. And we did it with comparison to the defendant. They never actually said the STR, what the results were of that comparison. They did throw that statistic in there for the DNA, for the paternity test, but that's different. They have been hiding behind statistics because they can. And they have been using statistics to stretch that, oh, it could be his DNA. I'm telling you that likelihood ratio, that 5.37 octillion, is prejudicial and inflated. That is not a match. It is not identity. It's called a likelihood ratio. A likelihood ratio does not measure in matches and it does not identify anybody. It is for the lab analyst to ask a question and make a comparison. The question was probably, how likely is it that Brian Kohberger's DNA is present? They slapped an octillion statistic on it. There's no reason to do that unless you're trying to overcompensate for something. And I've always said they have done the Olympics, the impossible, every step of the way with this DNA. So I think the motion for independent analysis of evidence is the defense asking for an independent analysis of the sheath. Most likely, there are mixtures on there because typically the trace transfer DNA are partial mixtures. That's the nature of them. Also, it's also likely that there's a blood mixture on that sheath. And I think we've all had a feeling that it's unlikely that there's this one pristine single source. But if you notice, they never actually say the single source matches Brian. The only time I've ever heard that, I think it was once in a hearing where Bill Nye was saying that it is Brian's DNA on the knife sheath. Oh my gosh, hello, welcome Truth and Justice, True Crime with Anna. Daniel says, right, they would have at least a DNA of the victims in the vicinity of the word was found reasonably. This makes sense. Yeah. And so I think what the defense is saying is there could be a mixture that excludes Brian. There could be multiple DNA profiles there, and there could be a male. And they could also be saying that trace transfer DNA is most likely a mixture. And they have been asking for the IgG information. I have a feeling they've been trying to ask for the lab notes because Riley Nolan, she didn't know where the sheath was tested. If you recall the secret hearing where Ann Taylor asked her, and then we learned for the first time that the actual button was never tested. And then Riley Nolan came up with, oh, it must have been the inside of the snap. So she wasn't even sure where it was tested. And so that kind of like, it's unclear. There's ambiguity. That also says there's not a clear chain of custody, or the director of the lab, they would know that. They would know exactly what the procedure was and when the DNA was in somebody's hands. You know, they usually have to sign it, date it, and put the time on there and explain a little bit of what they did. And this is all on the chain of custody. But she couldn't even recall any of the chain of custody. She couldn't even recall where it was swabbed. She just said, I know it's probably the defendant's DNA. Thank you, Daniel. It makes sense that the DNA of the victims would be found on the sheath, not just the alleged assailant. Right. And so I'm sure that whatever testing materials that the defense received from the state, it's probably not complete. And I don't think that the defense had any standing to ask for further testing until now, until they were like, we have a tip, a credible tip. We have proof for alternative suspects. And I think that gives them some sort of standing so that they can now ask for the independent analysis of the sheath. Because odds are there is other DNA on there. And I think that they've known this for a long time. And the thing is, like I said before, the state only has to say it could be his DNA. It doesn't actually have to be. And we know that this case has been weird since the beginning. And what if it's that piece that they're just kind of posting on statistics? But in reality, it's a mixture. They probably don't even know if it's Brian Kohberger's DNA. And so the defense is probably like, well, we don't know if it's his either. That's why we need to get it further tested. And I know that one of their, I think it was one of their DNA experts said, yeah, it's probably Brian's DNA. But the thing is that none of them have been, oh, Miss Potts, thank you so much. That's my girl from way back in the day. Oh, thank you, Miss Potts. It's so good to see you. Oh yeah, Truth and Justice, True crime with Anna D. That, yeah, that's probably why the state is so mad. You know, well, the other day my last live, I realized that there are a lot of AI bots in this case. I think we've all talked to them. I am me, hello. And so then I was thinking, what was the main objective of these bots? I know a lot of them have said, oh, it's a clean profile. That's very odd to say. Like, why would anybody be like that? It's a clean profile. That's because the state wants everybody to think it was a clean profile, even though they can't say it actually was. And I think the person who kept saying that, they said it like over and over. I think they were actually a bot. So, and if you notice that their slippery wording, they've never actually said that it was Brian Koberger's DNA. What they said was it's 5.37 octillion more likely to be his than anyone else. And that's fine. In the US legal system, that's fine. They can just say it could be theirs, more likely than that guy, but they don't have to have any proof whatsoever of that. All they have to have is it could be, and here are some methods that say it might be, but they don't need that. And I do think behind the scenes, especially because I think it was the third motion to compel. I think that was one of Ann Taylor's longest ones. I think that could have been the last one that we saw. And it was very detailed about everything she wanted, from the lab to, their credentials, their error rates. I think she wanted 6 months before the crime and 6 months after. So she's been very detailed and very strategic about asking for everything DNA related. Right, statistical hocus pocus, Daniel. Aw, yeah. Let's see. I don't have that up right now. I'll have to find out what it is. That's a great idea. And as we know, the state has strung together all of this evidence, and everyone's saying they only have the DNA. What if they don't even have the DNA? And the defense has been coming for it, and they have been coming for it hard this whole time. And I'm telling you, Hitler, we don't know much about him. We don't know his personality. I don't know for sure, but he has been slowly closing and narrowing what the state is allowed to do with the DNA. Oh my gosh, they live. Welcome. Good to see you in here. Oh. Oh gosh, I completely forgot what I was just saying. Oh, yay, make sure to hit the thumbs up, guys. Thank you, Miss Potts. Kibo, I love all your hearts and flowers. Oh, Daniel has hearts too. That's great. Oh, Miss Potts has lots of hearts. You guys are great. All the hearts. And then I Am Me has a pretty lipstick emoji in her name. Oh, I love that. Oh, Daniel gave me some painting nails. I love it. Oh, that's right. Thank you, Miss Hot Potts. So let me see if I can bring it up. I made a post about this before. It's that memorandum. Let's bring that up. Actually, I made a whole video on it. Oh, that's the wrong place. I have two monitors now, and I'm trying to figure out which which one is which. Memorialize. Yep, here it is. All right, we're going to zoom in a little and go to the bottom of page 6. And I'll show you the first time he narrowed it, or may not be the first time, but a significant one. 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. This statistic, I think Hitler is aware of the state's bullshit, and so that I do think he's going to allow this independent testing if he hasn't already. Because listen to what he says here. This is his memorializing. He already ruled on this, I guess, during the hearing, so he just wanted to put it in writing. And it's in regard to defense motion in limine number 14, the statistical analysis. Now, the defense put statistical analysis here in the title, but this is really that 5.37 octillion statistic. And it says here, defense moves in limine to exclude any misleading comments about the meaning of the likelihood ratio for DNA purposes. Specifically, the defendant seeks to avoid attempts to define the likelihood ratio through comparison to world population. All right, let me go to the footnote number 6, and then we'll get back to reading the last part of that paragraph. Defendant's motion is directed toward the prosecutor's questioning of a lab analyst at the grand jury proceedings. There, the analyst testified that her DNA testing showed the profile developed from the knife sheath was 5.37 octillion times more likely to be seen if the defendant was the source than if an unrelated individual randomly selected from the population is the source. In an attempt to clarify this result, the prosecutor asked whether this meant if there were 1.37 octillion people, that it would be that Brian is one out of the many octillion. The lab analyst explained why this comparison is not a proper way to view the likelihood ratio. That's because the likelihood ratio is not about identity. So when they're asking, is Brian the identity? Is he one out of this octillion? No, because that's not appropriate. You can't like view it that way, because it's asked the question, is this person's DNA present? It doesn't go beyond, is this a person out of any octillion? Okay, so Hitler is telling us here, the defendant moves in limine to exclude any misleading comments about the meaning of the likelihood ratio for DNA purposes. Specifically, the defendant seeks to avoid attempts to define the likelihood ratio through a comparison to the world population. The state agrees that this type of comparison is inappropriate. The state conceded. The state agreed with the defense that they used it in an inappropriate manner. That's what that means there. So then the court says the court grants defendant's motion insofar it applies to the question asked by the prosecutor at the grand jury proceeding, which both sides agree was not proper. However, the court will not dictate how the question is to be asked at trial. If the defendant believes there is a similar misrepresentation, they misrepresented what that 5.37 octillion statistic represents as to the likelihood ratio at trial, he can object at that time. So what that likelihood ratio did was just completely prejudice Brian. Like, you can't unring that bell, and nobody's really sure what the actual amount of DNA that was recovered. Nobody's really sure if it really is a single source. I know the defense has said, or the prosecution has said that multiple times, but the defense, I think, has suspected that it is a mixture, and they have been pushing for more testing just to verify that. And so I don't think they've gone either way to say it was Brian's or not Brian's. In fact, it might actually be beneficial if they said, yeah, it could be, but we don't know, because it could be a mixture. And I think that actually makes their argument stronger than to say, oh no, it's not Brian's, but we do want it tested. See, that doesn't quite work. I think it works when they kind of stay in the middle, and Bill Nye had accused them of that. I think Bill Nye was like, so the defendant wants to say that it's not his DNA, but he also wants rights to it. he's never explicitly said it was his DNA, but he wants it both ways, or, something like that. And so they are going to remain in the middle. I know that in one of their motions, their DNA expert said it's most likely Brian's, but most likely is most likely. That's not definitive. So they're going to say, well, we don't know. Nobody knows if it's actually his. And so the state conceded that they used the 5.37 octillion in the wrong way. So if the state didn't concede, I don't know what Hippler would have done, but this narrows the scope of how they can talk about the DNA in court. So the next one here, where Hippler goes a little bit further to narrow how the prosecution can use the DNA. It says, defendant's motion in limine number 5, inconclusive data. Defendant moves to limit expert testimony about the Idaho State Police Forensics Lab's statistical analysis of a swab taken from the fingernail clippings of Madison Mogan. Item Q13.1, the testing revealed a likelihood ratio in the inconclusive range as to whether the defendant was a potential contributor to the DNA mixture. During her grand jury testimony, the lab analyst, Jane Miller, testified that inconclusive means that she was unable to say one way or another whether or not defendant is included in the mixture. Defendant argues that this is misleading language in that it allows for an inference that the defendant might be included, which she asserts is inaccurate. The state indicates it will not offer results of Q13.1 as inculpatory evidence, which defendant agrees renders his motion moot. However, the state changes course with regard to the evidence. It must first raise the matter with the court outside the presence of the jury, so anticipated testimony regarding the meaning of inconclusive can be discussed. At this time, however, the motion is denied. Okay. And so I think footnote number 5 is in here somewhere. And so footnote number 5 says, the scope of the preclusive effect of this ruling includes suggesting that specific individuals looked at and cleared by law enforcement are alternative suspects without first complying with the showing required by this order. So this one is a little different. This is still Hippler narrowing the scope. He's cleaning up the language that the prosecution can't use slippery language in this either. And it sounds like Hippler doesn't want ambiguous, unscientific descriptions of what the science actually is. So I think he's very subtle, but I think he wants clear explanations of the science that's being talked about. Too Fast for Flea's best names in the house. Too Fast for Flea says, I feel as if the only match is that they can tell it's DNA, but not to a point as to whom it may belong to, and is letting them shove foot and mouth at every hearing. At this point, they are ankle deep. I agree. They Live says, I love Ann Taylor's patience with the state's malarkey and her confidence in her client's innocence. I trust that she and Mastiff have this case solved. I agree with you. Well, welcome to Fast for Flea. So he's narrowing the scope again, that the state will not be able to misuse scientific data. He also is narrowing the scope because the effect of the ruling includes suggesting that specific individuals looked at, cleared by law enforcement, are alternative perpetrators without complying with this required by this order. Now, that to me just says we're going to clean up the data here. I want you to use words that are scientific. I don't want any loose language in here, but if anything does arise, we will address it then. And, you're going to comply by this order and you're going to raise the you will raise the issue with the court outside the presence of the jury. So this doesn't go directly to the mixture on the sheath, but it does go to limiting how loose the state can be with how they talk about forensic data. I'm going to go to one more, and it's going to be the state's response to the use of the terms touch and contactless DNA. Oh, and then I have to circle back. Okay, so it is the reply to, I can never find this one. Oh my gosh, I can never find anything. All right, I gotta try to put it up here then. It's the state's reply to the touch. That's the defense motion. Too Fast for Flea says, I'm guilty of looking at K-bar knives on Amazon after the crimes also. I bet 100K other true crime followers did also. Right, and they're trying to like string together a theory about how Brian replaced a knife. Why would anybody ever replace a knife? They would just be really far away from that knife. And why do they have to string it together? They should just have a receipt. You know? Where's the next one? Order, defendant's reply. There you go, state's response. Now, in here, I think Ashley Jennings wrote this. So she's going to quote Nolan here. And Nolan says, or Jennings says that Nolan goes on to explain how DNA can be transferred to an item, including that it could be transferred from one person to another before being deposited on the item. So here's the quote. DNA can be deposited on or transferred to an item through transfer of bodily fluids to an item, wearing an item, or handling an item. Primary and direct transfer refers to DNA transferring directly between individuals or between an individual and an object. Indirect or secondary transfer refers to transfer of DNA from one person or object to another person or object through an intermediary. She's just explaining what transfer DNA is. Nothing in there yet about it being Brian's. I do think she does go into that a comparison was done. Let's see here. Now, it says here, Miss Nolan's explanations and inference both go to the significance of the defendant's DNA on the knife sheath. Well, they do say it there. But she says the inference of the significance of the DNA on the knife sheath. It doesn't really say. See, this is that slippery language again that they were using in the PCA. So she's going to explain the inference and the significance of the defendant's DNA being on the knife. They should just directly say the defendant's DNA was on the knife, but instead they're just going to talk about the inference of it. I think that's their whole case there. They are only inferring that his DNA could be on the DNA on the knife sheath. They're not actually saying it is. So she's going to talk about the inference. They're inferring it could be on there and it could be his DNA. That's it. And so here we go, especially considering defendant's expert proposed testimony that at least implies the jury should attribute little to no significance to defendant's DNA on the knife sheath. Yeah, because if it's a mixture, that makes it even weaker. Do we even know the defendant's DNA is on the nice sheet if it's a mixture? The mixtures make it even more unreliable. And so the defendant argues that Nolan's opinion is admissible because she cannot conclusively offer an answer to the question of the when and how. I don't know if she could even offer up that what the actual amount that was recovered or how many markers were similar. And notice they never talk about how many markers were similar. We have never heard that. We have never seen that. And if they had that information, that would be very strong for their case, and we don't see it. Why wouldn't they tell us how many markers are similar? I think it's because they don't know. The defense knows that, and the defense needed whatever tip they got and the evidence they have for the alternative perpetrators. So I think they have standing for the independent testing. And I don't think Hitler would have granted, even if they had requested it before this moment in time. When I will show you another thing before, I thought in here that Nolan said, just a comparison. Okay, here we go. The state disclosed its initial expert disclosures. Experts from the Idaho State Police Lab who swabbed the knife sheath for DNA, swabbed the defendant for DNA, and compared the DNA from the knife sheath to the defendant's DNA. Based on those disclosures, the lab analysts who compared the DNA will testify that the defendant's DNA matched the DNA obtained from the knife sheath. So this is saying like two different things here. This is saying that the Idaho State Police did some actions. There are actions where they swabbed the knife sheath, they swabbed the defendant for DNA, and then they compared them. They're missing, where are the results? So then they're getting this expert to testify that the defendant's DNA matched and obtained from the knife sheath. We still don't get any numbers here. So someone is going to testify that that's Brian's DNA and it's matched. But where are the numbers? They're like still scooting by on these statistics. And okay, so that means, okay, Brian's DNA could be on there. But what it also means is there's no definitive proof that it is. Because they can claim that all day. They could say that they'll testify the DNA matched the DNA obtained from the knife sheath. And then they say here, the defendant disclosed as DNA expert. Defendant's DNA expert could not refute the DNA on the knife sheath matched the defendant's DNA, acknowledging that there is no support that Mr. Koberger's DNA was found on item 1.1, a swab from the knife sheath. There's no support that Mr. Koberger's DNA was found in the knife sheath. So yeah, the state can claim that they did comparisons. They can say, well, the disclosures say that it's the DNA that matched, but you need support for that. And that's not in here. And this motion is the state's response to the defendant's motion in limine number 6 in regard to the touch and contact terms. Okay, so, and then Ashley is scooting around the fact that there isn't any support to say that it is actually his, because then we're going right back to the result of transfer. It's like they're using an action again to mask the fact there isn't any support for the DNA. So they're going to try to just talk about if it's direct or indirect. And I think that's confusing, because now they're talking, they've gone away from a match to talking if it's direct or indirect. And so here it is. The defendant's DNA expert, she acknowledges there's no good support that Mr. Koberger's DNA was found on item 1.1, a swab from the knife sheath. Here we go. We have some comments. Too Fast for Fleas says, I'm guilty. Okay, I read that one. Yeah, I did too. The amount that was recovered was 2,000 times smaller than a grain of sand. They go after that instead of blood or DNA under the fingernails. It's like picking up a penny where there is 10,000. Right. So if you are a defense attorney in a death penalty case and you're presented with comparisons of DNA without a clear sense of chain of custody, without legitimate support, you're going to be like, I need independent testing on this. That's what a responsible defense attorney would do. So yeah, and they're going to say, to support my argument, there were other blood DNA samples at the scene. We have tips from alternative suspects, and we have, X, Y, and Z evidence. And so now we do think we have good cause to have independent testing. Ms. Potts says, how do they get from the DNA on the sheet to Koberger? Can't say CODIS, FBI, or IgG. My suspicion has always been the IgG never led to Brian. And even Payne testified at that hearing, the secret hearing, that the FBI never told them that it was Brian's DNA. So you're right, Ms. Potts. I don't think they found Brian through DNA. That's not what it sounds like here. And I know the misinformation bots and the misinformation mainstream media they're filling in the gaps of where the state can't. So look at what they've been trying to, their biggest narrative is that it's his DNA. I think we need to look at what are their driving themes, and then that's where we know the weaknesses are in the state's case. Too Fast for Please says, I'm happy when Miss Pat reads me Koberger story when I'm doing yard work on the weekends. That is so sweet. Kibo says, Shady Sheets Shenanigans. Oh my God, I can't even say that. That's so... Valenta K, welcome. Valenta K says, all in hats do is use Lucas Anderson case as an example of touch DNA can move from person to object. Ms. Potts says, I want to know how the state will argue and explain to the jury how they got to him without CODIS or IgG or FBI. That's going to be difficult. They probably will just mask it with a statistic and they'll say comparisons without any actual support. Okay. So that is their response to that. And then I want to bring up the order for it. That's up. Okay. So here we go again. This is the order on defendant's motion to eliminate for Riley Nolan and touch and contact DNA. So, well, Hippler, I thought, oh, can you hear me? I have that red notification that says, your connection isn't so good. You guys can hear me okay? Did I lose you? Too Fast for Flea says, Jennings had a vision of who it was and came up with Koberger as a tip. When she drank 2 buckets of Borg. Yep, totally. So I thought this was really well done by Hippler because he really looked at a lot of things and he really did everything he could within the parameters that he had. Wait a minute. What is IRE 403? Okay, before we look at that, this is what it comes down to. He wants to avoid the use of touch DNA, contact DNA, and trace DNA. He is still narrowing and hurting the state's argument about this DNA. He's still cleaning up the language in his courtroom. He's still, and the prohibition of the word trace DNA, I think that's the first of its kind. And I think that is going to improve the U.S. legal system for the better, to make it more fair. And he did that. Hitler did that. I think there are some cases where he deserves a lot of credit, and I do think he deserves credit for this one. And so if you notice, there's a trend here. He's slowly, like just methodically, very quiet, very subtle. You might not even know he's doing it, but he is making it so that only true scientific things will be discussed. And so now he's limiting the state so where it's going to be difficult for them to argue it was transfer DNA. But what I also want to do, okay, so let me read the first paragraph here. Defendant moves in limine to exclude the testimony of Riley Nolan, the lab manager with the Idaho State Police Forensic Services Laboratory, who was disclosed by the state to testify about touch DNA and the transfer of DNA generally, and more specifically, that the DNA located on the knife sheath was more likely the result of direct transfer. The defendant argues that Ms. Nolan's testimony, as well as any other testimony referencing the terms touch or contact DNA, and or purporting to be an opinion about the means or mechanisms of how the DNA ended up on the knife sheath, is irrelevant or impermissible under IRE 403 and fails to satisfy IRE 703. And then down here it says, however, the court requests that the parties instruct their witnesses to avoid use of the terms touch DNA, contact DNA, and trace DNA. And then he does go into a lot of scientific data and evidence. And he really does look at this. Let's see what he... See, the first thing... Okay, here we go. Let's read this a little bit. A knife sheath was recovered from the crime scene in this matter and swabbed for DNA. Okay, I don't think anybody is arguing that yet. A sample of DNA identified as Q1.1 was extracted from the swab by the Idaho State Forensics Lab. The DNA concentration was 0.168 mg/UL. This isn't an amount. This isn't a volume. It is a concentration. So we still don't know the actual amount. And even if it is the 1.68 mg, that is low template trace DNA. And that is also ambiguous because there's this drop, the alleles drop in and drop out. And it's not reliable when it's low template DNA, and especially if they're low-lying mixtures. And this is what the state is suspecting, or the defense suspects that. It was subsequently tested using standard DNA STR methods. The STR profile developed revealed that the DNA came from a single source male. It's just the language, it's not straightforward here. And then look at this. The first thing that Hitler quotes of Nolan, she's talking about transfer. Okay, let me read this quote here. Many complicated factors can influence the likelihood of transfer of DNA and the persistence of transferred DNA after disposition. Currently, DNA technology cannot conclusively answer the question of when DNA was deposited on an item, or by what mechanism, i.e. direct or indirect. It is possible the DNA detected on M2022-4843, item 1.1, resulted from secondary transfer. However, based on knowledge, training, and experience, in her opinion, given the quantity detected on this item is a concentration amount, not a volume or recovered amount, and given the DNA profile obtained, the single source is more likely the result of direct transfer. Anywhere in there, did she say it was the defendant? Even in this first quote, I don't see here where she says it's actually the defendant. They don't say it very often. And the only reason why it's been like repeated and it's kind of in our heads that it is his is because the mainstream media says it. But that mainstream media can say whatever they want. That doesn't make it actually true. And like I said, we should probably think about what the mainstream media and the AI bots have been trying to drive home the hardest, because those are probably the weakest parts of the state's case. Too Fast for Flea says, I seriously think that as one of the defendant's visual representations and would have 1 grain of sand in a clear little box that says the DNA found was 2,000 times smaller than this. Yeah. Then show how DNA was found with the blood on the rail, the gloves, and the fingernails. So if there was blood and there is a brass surface and there was trace transfer and it's probably low template and a mixture, how did that survive? And I think that's a question that a lot of people have. And it's like, where's the data that shows that it did? Where's the data that supports what you're saying? Yeah, you throw it in there every once in a while that you did comparisons, and every once in a while you see in there in these things that it was his DNA. But for the most part, they're trying to argue transfer. It's like, this is their main argument here. It's not, this is how many markers were. This was the chain of custody. This is what this shows. There's no authoritative voice here. It's all kind of like peripheral stuff. And I did want to look at IRE 403. Okay, so this is IRE 403. It's the Rules of Evidence. Idaho Rules of Evidence, Rule 403, excluding relevant evidence for prejudice, confusion, a waste of time, or other reasons. The court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. I think it will confuse a jury if the trace transfer, low template, partial mixture found on the brass inside the snap, or, I don't know if the state actually knows where it was swabbed. Is that recorded in the lab notes? I think that would confuse the jury. And it's interesting that the defense, where is it? They cite that right here. It's impermissible. And it fails to satisfy IRE 703. Okay, let's look at 703. Now, I think since the defense has been pushing to have this independent testing done for so long, and with Hippler slowly narrowing and taking away some of these things that the prosecution can and can't say, and redefining what the likelihood ratio is, that it's not identity, it's not a match. Like, what do you think he knows if he's slowly trying to clean up loose language like this? Okay. What is IRE Rule 703? The basis of an expert opinion testimony. Oh, look, I can zoom in. An expert may base an opinion on facts or data in a case that an expert has been made aware of or personally observed. If experts in a particular field would reasonably rely on those kinds of facts or data in forming an opinion or inference on the subject, they need not be admissible for the opinion to be admitted. But if the facts or data would otherwise be inadmissible, the proponent of the opinion may disclose them to the jury only if their probative value in helping the jury evaluate the opinion substantially outweighs their prejudicial effect. I don't know, I think that's kind of confusing to the jury if state's like, yeah, it's a mixture, but it could be Brian. Well, you're not even sure if it's Brian? Do you, and then Anne, she might be able to bring in other blood stains. So what is the jury going to think when there's not a clear chain of custody? And anytime if the state, because they're really being reined in here, if they use the words touch, contact, trace, or if they go in outside the scope of what he's allowed to, when Riley Nolan is allowed to talk a little bit about direct and indirect. If they do anything that misrepresents any of the scientific principles that have scientific data to back it up, the defense is allowed to object and strike, and then Hippler can advise the jury of a jury instruction, and that they are not allowed to consider what that is said. So that is all set up. And this is what Hippler has put a framework around. And it's like, why would he do that? I think that he's seen a pattern of uncertainty and ambiguity, when it comes to the chain of custody, when it comes to the confidence of the state, when they talk about the DNA. And I'm sure he's had a lot of trials where he can pick up on how fragile the state's case is. And I'm sure he's been in other trials where he's sensed the state's case is a fragile one. And he knows that the world is watching him. And, I think we've heard that he runs his courtroom just like an appeal courtroom. So he's probably making his own records so that it's very clear. And he's very aware that appeal courts will be looking at all his rulings, everything that he said, how he looks at the law. And I think he's being very cautious. And he does see the state's case is fragile. He's slowly trying to keep it up to keep his record clean. And I do think that he's going to allow for the independent testing because for justice, he's going to do that. And he may not have a choice here because the defense now has standing that they have proof of an alternative suspect. And they did also file the admissibility of emergency evidence. So they might even have more now. And they also objected to, because you remember how Hippler requested that information. The defense is like, no, we're not giving that up. not just yet. That's still part of our work product. But we do want to admit this over here. And we want to do it because it's going to, jeopardize the safety. That's what an emergency thing is. And when you have an emergency motion, usually it's ex parte. So if he grants that, they get an ex parte meeting with him, and then they get, I guess, to talk about whatever the subject was the emergency admission of evidence or whatever. So it seems like Hitler has a sense of what's going on here. He is slowly, barely noticeably making moves, and I think he's trying to make his record clear. And I think it should be very important that over the years, the state has not been confident in talking about the DNA. The only thing that makes them look confident is the mainstream media and the AI bots. There's a reason for that. And I'm guilty of being persuaded occasionally by that stuff. I'm usually pretty good at picking up neurolinguistic programming. That's why I can't watch mainstream media, because that's all it is. It's a program. They're programming people on how to think, and they want to program people on how to think about this case. And if you didn't catch my live last time, you should definitely catch it, because it's about AI bots. There was a study done that AI bots are able to change people's minds, and humans are not that successful at changing minds. And the bots are mean. And so they just come to all our posts, because anytime, Brian Koberger is entered as a keyword, they come. I don't think there's real people waiting around for people to post about Brian Koberger so they can talk about Brian Koberger and then make fun of everybody. I don't think that's a thing. I think these are bots. They've gotten a bit sophisticated. They're hard to tell. But they all do that same thing where they throw that hate around. It's the same, it feels like it's the same person each time. So I think they are employed, and they have been trying to drive home, the DNA was there, so that means he was there. I think there's a reason why the likelihood ratio is overinflated. I think there's a reason why the mainstream media is going so hard with the DNA. And I think there's a reason why Hitler is slowly cleaning up what they can and cannot talk about in the courtroom. And what he is doing is he's narrowing it to force. Literally, even though he says, I'm not going to force anybody to say anything, I'm not going to tell you how to pose the question, but he really is narrowing in on a small window to be able to use scientific, accurate data that is supported. And, if this is a long game, probably similar to how Ann Taylor has a long game. He's got one too. And, I think it's gone undetected for most people. But I know that on my last live, I was uncertain of what these motions could be. But I'm pretty certain now it has everything to do about the DNA, and they want it independently tested. And I feel like the whole case and how Hitler has been ruling on the DNA is just kind of naturally built up to this. And it's a really hard decision that Hitler has to make, because, in the interest of justice, for DNA transparency, and for the public, and for a fair trial, for due process, for the Constitution. It's not even about if it is Brian's or not. It's about the due process, the actual law part of this stuff. He's kind of up against a really tough decision that there's all this tension around it because of the law. Not even if it is his or not. It's the way the state has talked about the DNA, how it's unlikely that there is a strong chain of custody, and how Hitler probably picked up on that. And it's because of those law reasons that he might have to grant this. not because of they're, an honest person would grant it because it might not be his DNA. No, it's the law stuff. You know what I mean? Like, the law doesn't make sense to us a lot of the time, especially where the state doesn't really have to have a match. All they have to say is it could be, and then use some methodology to say, yeah, this is how it usually goes. And that's all they need. And that's all they've ever needed in the history of the US legal system. It doesn't even matter if the DNA matches. It helps, but it doesn't matter. And so I think that's what the state is doing. They're just saying, we have a DNA profile and we think it's Brian's. We have some experts that will testify to it. And the whole time, Anna's like, I'm pretty sure this is a mixture. We don't even know if it is his or not. And there's been this back and forth for all these years. But again, I think it strengthens her argument if she's like, yeah, it could be his. We don't want to argue if it's his or not. We just want to argue that it's a mixture. And it needs to be independently tested. Because most likely it is, especially with the blood DNA profiles. Most likely there's a mixture of the perpetrator and the victims. And the nature of low template trace transfer partial mixtures, that the nature of that is that it is a mixture. So even though they like to say it's a single source, I think Hitler picked up on the part where the chain of custody is probably not that strong. And, they're not even sure where they tested. Riley Nolan didn't know where the sheath was even tested. That's a red flag. When you're questioning a DNA expert and they're unsure about what happened to the object. That's bad. That's real bad. So I want you guys to all keep this in mind because I think we are being tricked. And wouldn't you think that that goes right along with everything else the state has been doing with every other piece of evidence? Every other piece of evidence could be argued it's irrelevant. They've never attached the car to the crime. We don't even know if it's a part of it. I don't think they've ever proved it's Brian's car. We can't tell what kind of car it is on the in those video clips. How do we even know the time of the crime is correct? There's been some weirdness around the autopsies. There's been weirdness around what kind of wounds they have. The coroner has been stated, I think she originally stated that the time of the crime was around 2, wasn't it? And also one of the mothers, Ethan's mother, said 2 a.m. is a dark hour. And, I think Lana has a very compelling theory, which if you haven't watched her last 2 lives, I would highly recommend Lana from Truth and Transparency. They were very good, very compelling. So the crime could have happened even earlier or even later. And, even SG, one of the parents of the victims, I think, isn't he quoted well, we don't know if that's true or not, but he did there's a rumor out there that he said, which we don't know if he did or not, that the Bethany and Dylan were up and texting while it was happening. And, if the crime happened a little later and it matches up with Bethany and Dylan's text, that would fall right in line. And so we don't really actually know what happened that night. We don't even know what the timeline was. And it's every aspect of this case, there's a problem with it. Everyone. Like, okay, so they talk about the cell phone 23 times. Well, is he going up and back? Is he just driving by on the highway? Because my example before was I moved out a little bit further than I normally am. And so I have to pass by the neighborhood where I grew up in to get to some of my friends. So anytime I could be going up there 12 times, but I'm going up and back, so that's 23 times, and all I'm doing is driving past my neighborhood, my neighborhood I grew up in. So we need context around whatever these phone pings actually are. What do they mean? Like, see, it's another ambiguous thing where it's like, does that mean, does that actually mean I got out of the car in my neighborhood I grew up in? No. I whizzed by. I whizzed by the exit. But my phone is still gonna ping on the tower there. So Kibo says tiny speck of mixed and inferred transfer DNA. Crazy. I agree. So let's think about the law and how it does not always translate to what we think a good person would do. A good person would say, I have a match here, I'm going to bring that to trial. That's not what states do. They don't have to do that. All they have to say is it could be, and it's admissible if there's some scientific data that's, and they could, and exactly what they said with the STR, they explained the process of it. Okay. Well, they can explain the process of transfer and have an ambiguous DNA sample, and it's admissible, unless the defense can challenge it properly, get it independently tested, and then go from there. And so Hippler can keep narrowing the scope of what the state can do. And what he's doing is he is slowly preventing the state from to get up there and provide unethical, unsupported claims. Not in his courtroom. Nope, I don't think that would happen. Even if he is a little biased, he's not going to allow sloppy DNA information to be in his courtroom. So I think some stuff going on here, Hippler. Very cool. But that's my opinion, that all of this with the emergency, or not necessarily the emergency ex parte, but the motion for independent evidence analysis, I think that's the sheath. And the defense finally has standing to be able to do it. How awesome. That Hippler is a little stealthy. That's all I had today. Thank you, everybody in chat, for being here. Thank you, replay crew. I hope you think about some of these things that I raised today, and let me know all your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.